In 1847, while refurbishing a derelict church in Millfield, Ohio, laborers stumbled upon a concealed vault tucked away under the intricately carved pulpit. This chamber, secured by a complex locking device that had remained hidden for decades, held a weathered leather-bound diary with yellowed pages that had been remarkably well preserved. Within its covers were grim records of fatalities, listing more than 8,000 individuals in a singular. Precise script that detailed the date, site, and cause of death, alongside unsettling financial audits of property values and estate assets. Accompanying this macabre register were 15 meticulously drafted maps of various settlements across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, each bearing the haunting inscription, "The Promised Land." These maps included elaborate topographical data identifying wetlands, flood zones, and other hazardous geographical traits, supplemented by notes regarding seasonal sickness trends and anticipated death rates. Before we proceed with the narrative of the Westbrook family's terrifying dominance over the Ohio borderlands, I invite you to subscribe to our channel if you have an interest in revealing the grimmest mysteries of American history. This platform is dedicated solely to those with the fortitude to confront the unsettling realities that traditional historians frequently overlook. Please share in the comments which state you are viewing from. You might live closer to one of the Westbrook's promised lands than you imagine. Now, let us return to the origins of this gruesome account. The early 19th century was defined by a surge of fervent religious passion throughout the country. The Second Great Awakening rippled across the fledgling United States, ushering in camp meetings, spiritual rebirth, and a proliferation of novel religious sects. This spiritual upheaval reshaped American culture, particularly on the frontier where the lack of organized denominations provided a perfect environment for magnetic orators and unorthodox doctrines. Joseph Harkins, the head carpenter in charge of the restoration, later swore that his hands shook so violently upon skimming the initial pages that he struggled to shut the diary. He informed the Cincinnati Enquirer in a subsequent interview that it was far more than a simple death toll. It functioned as a commercial ledger, where human existences were calculated in terms of financial gain and deficit. Church authorities immediately alerted local law enforcement, and Sheriff William Blackwood arrived to claim the artifacts. However, by the next morning, the diary and maps had vanished without a trace from the sheriff's secured office cabinet. 3 days later, Sheriff Blackwood was discovered deceased in his residence. The official cause was listed as heart failure, yet persistent whispers suggested his skin showed strange markings and his eyes were frozen in a look of sheer horror. The deputy who found him, Thomas Ridd, quit his post the following week and moved away from Ohio entirely, spending the rest of his life refusing to recount the scene he witnessed in the sheriff's bedroom. For nearly 2 centuries, the Millfield mystery of the Westbrook family has stood as one of the most chilling religious conspiracies in America. It was a methodical plot that ended thousands of lives through what is arguably the most malevolent land speculation scheme in the nation's history. The papers found that day in 1847 offered the first hard proof of a plot that had been rumored for years but never definitively confirmed until that point. Before we move forward with the account of the Westbrook family's reign of terror across the Ohio frontier, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to our channel if you enjoy exploring the darker corners of American history. This channel is specifically for those with the courage to look at the disturbing facts that mainstream history often ignores. Tell us in the comments which state you're located in. You may be nearer to one of the Westbrook's promised lands than you suspect. Now, let's go back to the start of this terrifying story. The dawn of the 1800s was a time of profound religious zeal in America. The Second Great Awakening swept across the young nation, bringing revivalist gatherings, spiritual awakening, and a surge of new faiths. This religious transformation moved through American life, especially on the frontier, where the absence of traditional churches allowed charismatic leaders and new ideas to flourish. These camp meetings could attract thousands who journeyed for days to take part, often reporting what they viewed as direct contact with the divine, such as fainting, glossolalia, and receiving life-altering visions. Ohio, having gained statehood in 1803, served as the portal to the American West, a region where land was abundant, regulation was scarce, and driven individuals could start over far from the scrutiny of established society. The state saw massive growth during this era, with its population surging from a mere 45,000 in 1800 to over 580,000. By 1820, this frantic expansion fostered a chaotic climate where new towns rose overnight and religious groups could take root with very little oversight. One of the men lured by this potential was Isaiah Westbrook, a bankrupt merchant from Hartford, Connecticut, who landed in Chillicothe, Ohio in the spring of 1803. Unlike many pioneers seeking to farm or trade, Isaiah arrived possessing something much more potent, a vision, or so he asserted. Standing over 6 feet tall with striking blue eyes and a powerful aura, bolstered by a perfectly maintained full beard, Isaiah quickly made a name for himself as a lay minister, starting within the Methodist circuits before carving out his own autonomous flock. He had a voice that listeners likened to velvet-trapped thunder, strong enough to fill any space, yet personal enough to make every individual feel as though he were speaking only to them. "The Lord has guided me to this spot," he proclaimed to the small assembly gathered in the town square that initial summer, his words echoing through the thick Ohio heat. He claimed that God had revealed to him that the Ohio Territory was destined to be a new Jerusalem for the elect. He argued that the old Eastern churches had become tainted and lazy, and that here, where the wilderness still resonated with the sound of creation, they would establish a stainless faith. Isaiah's magnetism was undeniable. Those who met him often noted a peculiar fire in his eyes and a total conviction in his speech that seemed to go beyond normal belief. Hannah Weathers, whose personal notes offer a rare first-hand look at Isaiah's early ministry, remarked that when Reverend Westbrook spoke of his holy visions, even the most doubtful listeners found themselves agreeing. She noted that there was a quality in his stare that made skepticism feel impossible, as if he could look directly into one's soul and answer the private doubts they had never voiced. Within a few months, his outdoor sermons were attracting people from miles away, and by winter, a small but fiercely loyal group had gathered around him, identifying themselves as the faithful of the new promise. Isaiah's spiritual framework was a premeditated mixture of traditional Christian tenets and radical new ideas that established him as an exceptionally powerful figure. He placed great importance on personal divine messages, the coming creation of holy townships, and the elevated rank of those who accepted his leadership concepts that would ultimately facilitate his fraudulent plans. Unbeknownst to Isaiah's disciples, he was not acting in isolation. His younger siblings, Daniel and Samuel Westbrook, had arrived inconspicuously in Ohio months prior, moving individually to various towns to prevent drawing notice to their alliance. While Isaiah focused on his ministry, Daniel and Samuel were actively acquiring expansive tracts of territory throughout the state, frequently picking sites that seemed worthless on official records, such as marshlands, jagged slopes, and riverbeds prone to flooding. They acquired these seemingly useless plots for a pittance, utilizing capital from their family's collapsed Connecticut trading firm, money that was legally owed to their lenders. Each sibling filled a specific and calculated role within their growing business. Isaiah, the oldest at 36 when they reached Ohio, provided the magnetic leadership and the spiritual foundation. With his commanding stature and convincing speech, he acted as the public representative of their cause. Daniel, the middle sibling at 33, maintained an academic air and had briefly attended Yale Divinity School before financial setbacks forced him to leave. He developed the spiritual defenses for their plot, writing numerous religious documents that gave an air of intellectual validity to Isaiah's claims. Samuel, the youngest at 29, served as the functional administrator, a cunning businessman with a gift for real estate law and monetary deceit who oversaw their expanding land assets. Legal documents from Connecticut show that the Westbrooks had tried a smaller version of this scheme in Rhode Island 2 years prior, starting a short-lived religious group that fell apart amidst claims of financial dishonesty. They fled just before court actions began, leaving behind massive debts and several angry investors who maintained they had been swindled. This previous disaster seemed to have provided them with critical insights regarding the necessary magnitude and seclusion required. For their trickery to work, the Westbrook siblings built their first lasting church in Millfield in 1805, a simple wooden building that nonetheless contained a remarkably high pulpit decorated with complex engravings. Built personally by Samuel, who was a trained woodworker, the height of the pulpit was a conscious choice, physically elevating Isaiah above his followers to visually emphasize his holy rank. The church's inception happened at the same time as Isaiah's most vital vision yet. "The Almighty has granted me a revelation," he told his flock on a freezing January dawn, his breath clouding in the cold interior. He claimed there was a spot less than 30 miles away that had been chosen as a sacred territory for their group, a land of plenty where the loyal would thrive like never before. He stated that God had assisted him in obtaining this holy soil for their congregation, so they could build a community pure in his eyes. This initial promised land was situated near what is now Logan, Ohio, a swampy region in the Hocking River Valley that the Westbrooks had bought for a tiny portion of its tax value because of its history of summer illnesses. Isaiah's disciples were unaware that this territory was located in one of the most severe malaria zones in the entire Ohio Valley, a reality well known to previous pioneers, who had given up on farming there after suffering terrible casualties. James Harrington, a cultivator who had lived in the region for a short time 2 years earlier and lost 3 offspring to sickness, tried to caution several families about the peril. He reportedly informed Ezekiel Winters, one of Isaiah's most loyal followers, after a Sunday gathering that the area becomes a death trap in the summer heat. He explained that the fever arrives with the warmth and that he had lost 2 children before recognizing the cause, warning that no amount of drainage or clearing would fix a land where the very atmosphere carried disease. His alerts were ignored. Isaiah had anticipated such doubt and worked it into his teachings, telling his flock in a sermon aimed at Harrington's warnings, though not mentioning him by name, that there would be those who challenged their faith. He argued that people fear the sacred ground because they lack the spiritual safety found only in total loyalty, claiming that the devil would send heralds to sow seeds of hesitation as a test of their commitment. By March of 1805, 47 families totaling 192 individuals had liquidated their properties and businesses to pool their funds and buy plots in the Westbrook's first sacred colony. The cost, while looking fair on paper, was actually a markup of more than 500% over what the siblings had paid just a few months before. Isaiah guided them to the site himself, assisting in the creation of a temporary chapel and managing the building of basic huts. He stayed with them through the end of April, holding daily worship and directing the colony's growth. The town was built around a central hall with family homes set in circular rows that Isaiah claimed mirrored the holy structure of paradise. Every morning started with collective prayer, and 3 times a week the entire colony met for long services where Isaiah lectured on his evolving beliefs regarding divine favoritism and spiritual cleansing through toil. He often reminded them as they labored to drain the soaked land for crops that paradise was not constructed without hard work. He noted that the holy land of their predecessors took 40 years of travel to find, and while their trial might look different, their compensation would be just as magnificent. Then, as May arrived and the first swarms of mosquitoes appeared, Isaiah shared another message. He solemnly announced during a night service that God was calling him to pave the way for more of the elect, stating he had to return to Millfield to lead others to their redemption so they could join the holy work. He left the next day, taking Daniel, who had been the colony's clerk, and leaving Samuel to manage the community's ongoing work. What followed was recorded by Elizabeth Winters, Ezekiel's wife, whose diary was kept hidden inside a cabin wall until it was found in 1890. This diary, now held by the Ohio Historical Society, offers the most detailed first-hand record of life in that first Westbrook colony. By June, the initial malaria cases surfaced, mostly hitting the young and the old. By the middle of July, the town had dug its first graveyard, and by August, that plot held 73 bodies. Elizabeth wrote on August 12, 1805, that they buried young Sarah that day, her script becoming increasingly shaky as she finished the note. That brings the total to 17 interments in the graveyard just since last week. The sickness claims them with such terrifying speed now. They are robust at breakfast, feverish by evening, and deceased before the following sunrise. Ezekiel maintains, "This is a trial of our devotion, yet I cannot fathom why the Almighty would require so many blameless lives." I proposed a retreat to Millfield, but Ezekiel insists that Reverend Westbrook cautioned that anyone deserting the Promised Land deserts their own redemption. Samuel Westbrook inspects every fresh mound, logging details in his ledger with such meticulous care, you would assume he was documenting births instead of fatalities. An entry from the diary on September 3rd exposes a grim observation. Samuel spends hours secluded in his hut with his accounts. Peering through the window yesterday, I observed him performing tallies after the Miller family was discovered dead in their residence. 4 additional souls added to his ledgers. There is something ghastly in his mechanical precision, no signs of mourning, only arithmetic. By the arrival of October, over half of the colony's members had died. The remaining survivors, frail and destitute, forfeited their claims and drifted away. Many perished during the trek to other towns, their remains stumbled upon by travelers along the rough paths leading away from the Promised Land. Those who managed to reach established communities were viewed with a mix of pity and distrust, seen as casualties of what many locals labeled a strange religious cult. In Millfield. However, Isaiah voiced deep mourning for the catastrophe, weaving the tragedy into a series of moving sermons about faith being forged in the fires of hardship. "Our kin have been summoned to paradise ahead of us," he preached to his expanding flock, his voice cracking with what seemed like sincere grief. "Their martyrdom has sanctified that soil and paved the way for a fresh revelation. The Lord tests most harshly those he cherishes most." What his disciples failed to grasp was that Isaiah had already instructed Samuel to secretly repossess the deserted estates using a network of legal intermediaries. By December 1805, the Westbrooks had regained control of nearly every acre from the collapsed colony at zero cost to themselves, while keeping the initial purchase money provided by the pioneers. This territory would eventually be sold to timber investors once the area's reputation for malaria had faded from memory. This cycle would recur over the subsequent 30 years with chilling consistency. Between 1805 and 1840, the Westbrook siblings founded 15 different Promised Land colonies across Ohio, Indiana, and eventually Illinois. Each followed the same basic blueprint. Isaiah would proclaim a holy vision naming a new sacred site. Daniel would generate spiritual justifications and rally the congregation. And Samuel would manage the logistics of real estate deals and building projects. The brothers polished their tactics with every new venture. Later sacred sites included not only malarial wetlands but also parched regions prone to harvest failure, floodplains that would submerge spring crops, and densely wooded areas that demanded impossible labor to make farmable. In every instance, the land seemed attractive to unseasoned eyes but contained fatal defects that were glaringly obvious to seasoned pioneers. Their 4th colony, established near what is now Marion, Ohio, in 1810, added a new layer to their plot. This site was located on a floodplain that looked rich and well irrigated. During the dry autumn, when potential buyers were first shown the land, what Isaiah characterized as a divine gift of plentiful water was actually a seasonal flood cycle that would submerge the entire town every spring, ruining harvests, polluting wells, and fostering waterborne illnesses. Particularly clever was their 7th colony in western Ohio. Started in 1815, this site featured soil that looked incredibly fertile, dark, and abundant. In truth, the dirt had a high clay content that could not hold water effectively and turned into a concrete-like shell when dry, making farming nearly impossible. By the time the pioneers realized this, winter had arrived, trapping them in a terminal situation until spring, by which time starvation and sickness had killed scores of people. What the Westbrooks developed was a style of religious victimization without precedent. In American history, noted historian Margaret Sinclair in her 1998 study of the affair, they intentionally chose territories that would generate the highest number of casualties within the first 12 months of habitation, enabling them to seize and resell the land multiple times to new batches of believers. Their plot merged the most toxic traits of spiritual manipulation and predatory commerce, turning faith into a weapon against the very people who held it most dearly. The second essential element of the Westbrook operation appeared around 1810, when they started requiring all followers to sign a covenant of faith, a paper that looked like a spiritual oath but acted as a legal transfer of property rights. These contracts, written by Daniel with the help of legal experts the siblings secretly met in Cincinnati, dictated that if a pioneer left their land or died without heirs who were members of the church, the property would return to the institution, which, in legal terms, meant the Westbrook brothers. The covenant's prose was skillfully designed to hide its true intent under layers of holy jargon. It read that as Moses guided his followers through the desert toward lands of milk and honey, the signer committed their worldly goods to the glory of the collective mission. Should the Lord call them home, or should their faith waver, they consecrated their land to the church's ministry for the benefit of others. Records from Franklin County, Ohio, indicate that between 1812 and 1815 alone, the Westbrooks seized more than 400 plots of land through these contract rules, mostly following the deaths of entire families in their third colony. The worth of these seized estates, even at frontier rates, topped $50,000, a staggering fortune for that era, worth millions in modern currency. As you listen to these chilling facts about how the Westbrooks used religious fervor for financial gain, consider the mindset behind such a cold-blooded ruse. If this account is unsettling, pass this video to someone who enjoys dark historical enigmas, like the video to support our work, and remember to subscribe. This platform uncovers the narratives that traditional historians often bypass, and the Westbrook plot is far more profound than the public understands. Let us continue our inquiry into how these three siblings sustained their lethal operation for many years. By 1820, the Westbrooks had gathered immense wealth. Isaiah, now adopting the title Prophet Westbrook, had constructed a primary cathedral in Columbus, Ohio, that matched the magnificence of many prominent East Coast churches. The structure, built from locally mined limestone and featuring grand stained glass windows brought in from Philadelphia, served as a tangible monument to the movement's prosperity. Its most notable attribute was a massive steeple that could be seen for miles, acting as a beacon to pull in new followers for the Westbrooks' expanding business. Daniel had assumed the designation apostle of the Scripture and managed an intricate theological system that validated their increasingly complex expectations of their disciples. His extensive writings filled several books, establishing a unique theology that merged traits of Methodism and Presbyterianism with radical ideas, specifically tailored to the brothers' goals. His primary spiritual innovation, the theory of progressive revelation, argued that the Almighty constantly shared new truths with chosen prophets, mainly Isaiah, and that doubting these messages was a form of holy defiance equal to heresy. Samuel, the most secretive sibling, directed their vast land holdings and monetary concerns from a secured manor outside Cincinnati. Unlike his more visible brothers, Samuel maintained a lonely reputation, strengthening the idea that he was occupied with profound spiritual tasks that demanded solitude. In truth, his manor served as the command center for their monetary kingdom, with a small group of clerks keeping precise logs of estates, fatalities, and earnings. Their organization had progressed significantly from its modest start. By 1825, the Westbrook Church claimed a following of over 3,000 members throughout Ohio and neighboring regions. Most of these followers were not inhabitants of the lethal Promised Land colonies, but were typical churchgoers who went to standard services and provided monetary aid through tithes and gifts. This wider congregation offered both social standing and a steady pool of potential candidates for new colonies. The siblings had also constructed a tiered organizational model that protected them from direct participation in the most questionable parts of their business. Elders and deacons, reliable lieutenants who had demonstrated their steadfastness, now managed many of the routine duties of colony oversight and land transfers. This setup permitted the Westbrooks to maintain a facade of ignorance regarding the conditions in the colonies while continuing to gain from their ruin. Their rising fortune allowed for increasingly advanced methods of functioning. Real estate acquisitions were now performed through a web of front companies and intermediaries, making it hard to link land ownership back to the institution. Colony provisions were supplied by church-affiliated firms at high prices, creating a further source of income. Even the burial rites for the unavoidable. Victims were turned into profit through a church run. Funeral business that billed mourning relatives for holy coffins and burial plots the siblings might have persisted indefinitely if not for the arrival of a young woman named Martha Collins. In the spring of 1838, Martha, a 22-year-old from a respected family in Boston, went to Columbus to see her cousin Emma, who had joined the Westbrook congregation the year before. As the daughter of a well-known lawyer with ties to Massachusetts political groups, Martha had received an education rarely afforded to women of that time, including training in bookkeeping and estate law under her father's supervision. Portrayed in period accounts as having a quiet persistence and exceptional insight, Martha initially went to services to be kind to her cousin but soon grew alarmed by what she saw. She noticed contradictions between the church's stated principles and its actual operations, specifically the extravagant lives led by the Westbrook brothers compared to the humble conditions forced upon their disciples. Isaiah Westbrook is no common orator. She informed her father in April 1838 in a letter kept in the Collins family records. He speaks with a power that seems to completely bypass the logic of his audience. When he names families picked for the subsequent sacred colony, they react as if they are receiving a massive honor. Though I have seen these choices often focus on those who have just inherited money or liquidated businesses for cash. There is a methodical trend to these choices that worries me greatly. Martha's letter went on with a point that showed her rare perceptiveness, noting that the most alarming part was not the sermons themselves, but the events that followed. She observed Samuel Westbrook, the brother who almost never preached, having hushed meetings with church leaders right after families were picked. These talks felt more like commercial deals than spiritual guidance. Martha's doubts grew when her cousin Emma was chosen for the holy privilege of acting as a private clerk to Daniel Westbrook. This job gave Emma, and consequently Martha, entry into the private rooms used by the siblings in Columbus. Martha used this chance with great cleverness, pretending to be a simple, loyal follower to move through the church offices without causing alarm. What Martha found there would eventually destroy the Westbrook dynasty. While sorting through documents in Daniel's study one day in early May, she found a locked cabinet of a peculiar style. Emma, who had been given the keys for her work, innocently opened it when Martha acted curious about what was inside. Inside, Martha discovered precise maps for all 15 promised land colonies with notes detailing soil quality, drainage issues, and sickness trends. Most appalling were the detailed records of deaths thousands of individuals categorized by colony and year, with the value of their property written next to each name. These papers exposed the full scale of the Westbrook plot, including estimates of predicted death rates for each site and tallies of expected land repossessions. One especially horrifying paper described the selection standards for covenant families, a system for finding potential pioneers with high financial worth and few family ties who might later try to reclaim their land. "I cannot describe the dread I felt," Martha later stated in a testimony given to the Ohio state government. These were far from chronicles of unfortunate losses. They functioned as inventory logs where human existences were reduced to fiscal estimates, complete with forecasted death rates for every colony. They possessed and had always possessed precise knowledge of what fate awaited these individuals. The fatalities that Isaiah characterized as holy trials were, in reality, meticulously choreographed results intended to maximize land acquisition while reducing legal obstacles. Martha's revelation occurred just as the Westbrooks were organizing their 16th colony, which was perhaps their most daring and lethal venture yet. Situated in a secluded region of southern Illinois, this prospective promised land was located in an area infamous for both malaria and fierce skirmishes with the local Native American tribes. Private papers indicated that the siblings expected a death rate surpassing 70% within the first 6 months. The Illinois colony marked a progression of their tactics. Papers in Daniel's cabinet showed intent to expand their reach beyond their own congregation, using methods to attract German and Scandinavian immigrants, who would be unfamiliar with frontier hazards or American legal rights. The estimated profit from this single colony alone exceeded $75,000, some greater than all their previous ventures combined over a period of several weeks. Martha covertly duplicated essential records, including colony maps and segments of the mortality logs. Working by candlelight in her rented room, she carefully recreated the proof, hiding these duplicates inside a hollowed-out Bible-cynical sanctuary for evidence of spiritual betrayal. Her intent was to flee to Boston with these proofs and alert federal authorities through her father's political ties. However, as the date of her escape drew near, she sensed a shift in her treatment by the church community. Congregants who were once cordial became aloof or overly inquisitive about her movements. She noticed strangers monitoring the house where she resided. "Emma mentions that Daniel has been asking strange questions about my behavior," she noted in her final letter home, which was never mailed but was later found hidden in her Columbus residence. "Yesterday, Isaiah invited me to a private prayer session to address what he termed worries about my holy devotion. I declined, citing sickness. This morning I spotted a man shadowing me through the market. I suspect they are on to me. If anything happens to me, please understand that the Westbrook brothers are not holy men, but merchants of death. Their promised lands are slaughterhouses chosen specifically for their lethal traits." Martha's intuition was correct. Unbeknownst to her, a congregant had spotted her duplicating papers late one night and informed Samuel Westbrook. The siblings immediately initiated a quiet probe into the security risk, with Samuel traveling from Cincinnati to Columbus to personally oversee the matter. Church logs recovered decades later show an emergency meeting of the brothers and their inner circle on May 15, 1838, with the vague agenda item addressing the Collins situation. On the night of May 17, 1838, Martha tried to board a coach for Pittsburgh, the first leg of her return trip. She never arrived. According to the coach driver's log, a young woman fitting Martha's description approached the station, but was intercepted by 2 men who led her away after a brief talk. A witness later recounted seeing her enter a church carriage with a man thought to be Samuel Westbrook. She was never seen again. The official story from the Westbrook Church was that Martha had received a holy call to join the advance team for the Illinois colony. When her relatives in Boston asked questions, they received letters supposedly from Martha detailing her spiritual path and asking for no further contact. Handwriting experts would later prove these were fakes, likely penned by Daniel Westbrook, whose academic past included training in forging documents. Martha's disappearance might have stayed an unsolved enigma if it hadn't sparked a sequence of events that would finally reveal the Westbrooks' atrocities. Her father, William Collins, a noted Boston lawyer with ties to Senator Daniel Webster, refused to credit the church's story. He went to Columbus in July 1838 and started his own probe, employing local investigators and offering large rewards for leads. Collins was a formidable opponent. His legal career involved several prominent cases in Massachusetts, and he tracked his daughter's disappearance with the same systematic resolve that brought him success in court. He set up a command center in Columbus and began methodical interviews with church members, providing financial rewards for information that soon surpassed what the Westbrooks could offer. This outside heat happened at the same time as internal splits within the Westbrook group. Their decades of success had led to hubris and sloppy mistakes. Isaiah's sermons grew more dark and apocalyptic, vowing holy vengeance against enemies of the faith, thinly veiled threats against anyone doubting their rule. Daniel had developed a dependence on laudanum that ruined his consistency, leading him to give conflicting spiritual orders that puzzled the flock. Samuel, always the most practical, had started moving wealth to New Orleans accounts. Likely planning a getaway, these gaps created a chance for Jacob Miller, a deacon in the Columbus congregation who had served the siblings for nearly 20 years. Miller had just lost his daughter and grandchildren during the first summer of the Illinois colony, victims of what church logs coldly labeled marsh fever. His sorrow shifted to fury when he by chance found papers suggesting the Westbrooks knew about the colony's lethal nature before sending people there. The breaking point was when Miller heard Samuel discussing Martha Collins' permanent silence with another church leader. The talk, held in what they thought was a vacant office, included mentions of handling the situation the same way we handled the Peterson woman in 29, a reference to another missing person never probed. In September 1838, Miller met with William Collins, providing inside proof of Martha's findings. More critically, he revealed the brothers' most guarded secret, a master register of all deaths, land transfers and earnings since 1805. This book, which the brothers called The Accounting, was allegedly kept in a secret vault under the pulpit of the old Millfield Church, now a shrine for the sect. They call it The Accounting, but not just for money, Miller told Collins in a sworn testimony. It is their version of a holy tally, a record they think proves they are right. Isaiah believes these deaths serve a higher goal. Daniel has built complex holy excuses, but Samuel sees only the wealth. Would you like me to generate a historical-style image of Martha's hollowed-out Bible, or perhaps a Victorian-era map of the Illinois killing fields? He maintains that book with the cold detachment of a financier recording profitable deals. Armed with this intelligence, Collins contacted Ohio Governor Wilson Shannon, who gave the green light for a confidential probe to avoid alerting the Westbrooks. State officials organized a simultaneous raid on multiple church sites for December 1838, yet the mission was compromised by a church mole within the governor's staff. Alerted to the coming raid, the Westbrooks initiated what they marketed to their flock as a purification ceremony, though it was actually a massive incineration of incriminating proof. Fires raged for 3 days at church sites across Ohio, with Samuel personally managing the disposal of financial ledgers from their Cincinnati hub. Observers described wagons overflowing with crates of documents being driven to undisclosed locations under the protection of armed guards. The most intense clash took place at the Millfield Church, where Isaiah arrived with a group of stalwarts to save the accounting. They were intercepted by Sheriff Thomas Redfield, acting on a tip from Jacob Miller. The resulting skirmish killed 2 disciples and left Isaiah injured, but the brothers managed to flee with the bulk of their vital records. This event triggered what the press dubbed the Westbrook Exodus. Over the following 3 months, the siblings cashed out what they could and retreated south toward New Orleans, accompanied by about 60 loyalists. Their flight through Kentucky and Tennessee was shadowed by Collins, private investigators, and federal marshals. Executing fraud and conspiracy warrants from Ohio, the inquiry widened as they traveled, with multi-state authorities finding more proof of their atrocities. In a Nashville room vacated by Daniel, agents found fragments suggesting the brothers were planning similar operations in Texas and Central America, featuring notes on lands known for yellow fever and other tropical plagues. The final chapters of The Brothers' lives are lost in conflicting stories. The most credited version, based on the court accounts of followers who eventually gave up to the law, places all 3 Westbrooks on a New Orleans-bound steamboat in February 1839. These records state that as federal agents moved in, Samuel betrayed his siblings, vanishing with the majority of their remaining wealth during a stop in Natchez, Mississippi. Sarah Holloway, a loyalist on that southern escape, later gave a deposition that offered a rare look at the brothers' crumbling bond. She noted that by Natchez they were barely on speaking terms. Isaiah was immersed in prayer, believing in a divine rescue, while Daniel was mostly incoherent in a laudanum-induced stupor. Samuel viewed them with open scorn. telling Isaiah the night before Natchez that his God had failed them, and it was time to look out for himself. Isaiah and Daniel. Now fugitives with fading funds reportedly made it to New Orleans to find a boat to Cuba. On the night of March 12, 1839, both were killed in what police called a merchant's brawl that turned lethal on the New Orleans docks. Some historians believe this swift conclusion to the hunt may have been an extrajudicial execution ordered by officials who feared a public trial would expose how the brothers operated with such freedom for so long. A witness at the docks later swore Isaiah died clutching a small leather book, perhaps the missing piece of the accounting. His last words were reportedly not a plea for mercy, but a bold boast that their work was recorded in heaven and could never be erased. Samuel Westbrook's path is the most enigmatic. Sightings placed him in Cuba, Mexico, and England in the years after his brothers' deaths. The strongest evidence comes from Brazilian police files, documenting the 1847 arrest of an American named Samuel West for running a sham religious colony near São Paulo. The physical description and the tactics used match Samuel Westbrook perfectly. This individual died in a cell before his trial, allegedly from self-poisoning. A diary taken from him by Brazilian agents held entries that seemed to confirm his true identity, noting that his brothers lacked foresight by limiting their work to the American frontier, whereas he realized the model could work anywhere that faith blinds. Logic, the most haunting aspect of the Westbrooks, is not just the volume of their crimes believed to have caused between 7,000 and 9,000 deaths, but how skillfully they utilized the American religious climate to execute them. They thrived in an era of massive spiritual change when new faiths were common on the frontier. Their colonies were secluded enough to hide their nature but close enough to travel routes to lure new prey. They preyed on the structural flaws of a young nation, the lack of communication between towns, the absence of frontier law, and the constitutional shield for religion that made police hesitant to probe even the most suspicious church acts. Their business was a perfect convergence of spiritual deceit, physical isolation, and greed that allowed a high death toll to mount for decades. As historian James Thornton wrote, religious liberty provided the room for both true faith and lethal fraud, and the frontier's distance from authority made it impossible to tell a dangerous cult from a sincere church until it was too late. In that vacuum, the brothers built what might be the most lucrative killing spree in the history of America. Would you like me to create an image of the accounting ledger as described by the investigators, or perhaps a portrait of Samuel Westbrook during his final days in Brazil? The siblings' enterprise succeeded not only due to their own craftiness, but because it tapped into profound mental susceptibilities. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, an expert on 19th-century spiritual groups, clarifies that the Westbrooks provided the very things every borderland pioneer craved: a sense of belonging, a clear mission, and holy comfort within a turbulent and perilous setting. By portraying their colonies as locations picked by the Almighty, they converted standard property deals into a sacred duty. Doubting the promised land was not viewed merely as a critique of real estate. It was seen as a direct challenge to the Creator's intent. What made their deceit especially powerful was the way they wove it into legitimate holy rituals. Sunday worship in Westbrook halls followed familiar Protestant structures. Their songs were common Methodist or Baptist works, and their fundamental beliefs redemption through devotion, the value of fellowship, and awaiting the return of Christ-matched mainstream Christianity. This mask of normalcy made their lethal changes much harder to spot. Very few grasped that the strength of the Westbrook plot came from a deep mastery of both theology and the human psyche. During an era where spiritual identity was the core of American life, they built a story where questioning their rule was the same as questioning God. This channel is dedicated solely to those who want the raw truth about the grimmest parts of American history. If you have followed us this far, you are someone who prizes historical truth over easy fables. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell, and pass this video to others who value these buried accounts, the consequences of the Westbrook plot, echoed through the nation for many years. In Ohio, the outcry led to the initial state statutes governing religious property ownership and demanding fiscal openness from spiritual groups. These Westbrook laws, as they were titled, created a framework for telling the difference between holy liberty and criminal deceit, affecting laws in several states. Various promised land sites were eventually taken back by survivors or their heirs, though many stayed deserted, bleak reminders of a horror too intense to reclaim. These locations became the basis for local myths and fears. The first Logan colony, where the initial fatalities occurred, stayed empty for nearly half a century after the truth came out. Neighbors spoke of strange sightings near the decaying huts, though these tales likely came from the mental weight of the history rather than actual ghosts. When the territory was finally utilized again in the 1890s, laborers reportedly balked at digging near the old colony burial ground. The most thorough list of the Westbrook casualties was created through the tireless work of William Collins, who kept digging long after the siblings were dead. Collaborating with Jacob Miller and other former disciples, Collins built the Westbrook Victims Registry, which listed 8,432 deaths directly caused by the brothers' colonies. This list, kept at the Ohio Historical Society until 1915, served as the foundation for small relief payments to survivors approved by the Ohio government in 1845. Collins spent the rest of his life on this mission, using his vast wealth to find survivors and prove the siblings' guilt. His efforts grew from simple bookkeeping into one of the first methodical examinations of spiritual victimization in America. He wrote in 1850 that this was never just about the crimes of one family. It was about how the Westbrooks showed the gaps in how we balance holy freedom with public safety, issues the country must face to stop similar horrors. Emma Collins, Martha's relative who had unknowingly helped her probe, felt deep remorse after discovering the reality of the church she joined. She turned into a vital witness for the state, giving essential facts about the operation despite threats from remaining loyalists. Once the trials ended, she founded a refuge in Columbus for women fleeing predatory spiritual groups, one of the first of its kind in the nation. While most physical proof of the Westbrook plot has disappeared, their halls torn down, records burned, and colonies overgrown, certain relics still appear. In 1890, a farmer near the old Logan site found a mass grave with at least 40 sets of remains, 27 of them children, all showing they died from sickness. The way they were buried suggested a rushed interment during a plague, matching Elizabeth Winter's notes. In 1923, work on a Columbus building found a hidden stash of church papers, including colony maps and land deeds. These documents, now in the Ohio State Archives, offered new views on the brothers' tactics, including secret codes used to hide their true goals in letters. More recently, in 1998, an old desk from a Cincinnati auction was found to have a false bottom hiding Samuel Westbrook's private diary from 1830 to 1832, the diary, which is currently being verified at the Smithsonian, has notes suggesting the siblings may have tried to grow their business into other crimes like insurance fraud and identity theft, ideas very advanced for their time. Digs at several colony sites in the 1970s found physical proof backing the survivors' stories. At the 5th colony site near Springfield, Ohio, experts found foundations for huts built in flood-prone spots, even though higher land was right there, proving they were intentionally put in danger. Soil tests from several sites proved historical reports of land that was unfit for farming or living. Perhaps the most alarming thing is the lasting reach of the Westbrook spiritual model. Parts of their ideas, especially chosen colonies and covenants of faith, have shown up in various groups throughout American history, suggesting their texts were still being used long after they died. As recently as the 1980s, police in Montana broke up a group whose bylaws had sections identical to the Westbrook Covenant, though no direct link was found. Spiritual experts have found what they call Westbrook trends in various predatory groups, a magnetic leader claiming holy power, moving followers to secluded areas, and money rules that shift wealth to the leaders. The Westbrooks did not invent spiritual deceit, as theologian Dr. Robert Harmon says. but they turned it into a terrifyingly perfect system that has sadly served as a guide for others. Would you like me to create a summary table comparing the various promised land settlements mentioned, or perhaps generate an image of the 1847 discovery of the hidden compartment? Martha Collins, the courageous investigator who set the Westbrook's collapse in motion, was formally pronounced deceased in 1845 after extensive hunts failed to uncover any sign of her. Her father founded an organization in her memory aimed at exposing spiritual swindles, which functioned across the remaining decades of the 19th century. The Martha Collins Society sponsored probes into questionable holy sects and offered judicial aid to individuals attempting to exit restrictive organizations, a mission that persists through descendant groups in the present day. In 1890, a female in San Francisco asserting she was Martha briefly held the public's focus, but inquiries demonstrated she was a pretender hoping for monetary profit from the Collins estate. The actual destiny of Martha Collins continues to be one of the most lasting enigmas of the Westbrook affair, with hypotheses spanning from homicide at the hands of Samuel Westbrook to a fresh life, started under a pseudonym in a different land. What became of Martha Collins stands as the Westbrook's ultimate mystery. As analyzed by Elizabeth Chambers in 2005, the siblings carried that information to their deaths, leaving behind inquiries that might never find resolution. Occasional reports of Martha Collins sightings persisted well into the 20th century, evolving into a facet of American urban legend. During the 1920s, a senior resident in a Paris hostel allegedly recounted tales of the Westbrook siblings to other guests before vanishing when travelers from America showed curiosity in her story. In 1943, a gift to the Ohio Historical Society featured a locket housing what seemed to be a portrait of an older woman with a likeness to Martha, though its origins were never authenticated. The last recorded mention of the accounting, the primary logbook tracking the brothers' business, shows up in a note from a New Orleans relic merchant to a Boston buyer in 1879. The correspondence details a highly peculiar book filled with data on spiritual colonies and their calamitous endings, encased in crimson leather with distinct brass ornaments. The merchant noted buying it from the property of a late seaman, who asserted he got it from the belongings of a spiritual man who died on the piers many decades prior. The note suggested the volume had been purchased by an anonymous European enthusiast, and its current whereabouts are a mystery. Data implies that fragments of the Westbrook network outlasted the siblings' ruin. Judicial files from across the Midwest record trials against people identified as previous church leaders who tried to start up comparable, smaller-scale ventures. As late as 1870, police in Nebraska broke up a colony that showed remarkable parallels to the Westbrook framework, directed by an individual who had functioned as a deacon in the Columbus congregation. The Westbrook plot demonstrates how easily spiritual loyalty can be turned into a tool of violence when paired with avarice and magnetism. Their narrative acts as a cautionary tale regarding the perils of blind belief and the fragility of those looking for holy significance. In the American spiritual environment, where liberty of conviction is a cornerstone but regulation is frequently scarce, the boundary between genuine holy creativity and fatal victimization stays alarmingly narrow. What is your opinion on this grim era of the American past? Do you feel that every detail about the Westbrooks has surfaced, or are there still enigmas hidden in the nation's spiritual history? Post your views in the section below. If you appreciated this look into America's concealed terrors, follow us, activate the alerts, and pass this along to others who enjoy historical puzzles. This platform is not intended for the general public, but only for those courageous enough to look at our country's grimmest realities. Would you like me to create an image of the red leather-bound accounting ledger with its unique brass fittings as described in the 1879 letter?